Welcome to the RE Podcast, the first dedicated RE podcast for students and teachers.
My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this is the RE Podcast, the podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, which it is, and I'll prove it to you. On today's episode, I am absolutely honoured to have Anthony G Reddie, world-class scholar from Bradford. He has so many accomplishments, it might take actually an entire episode to list them. A fellow of both Cambridge and Oxford, the latter for which he is the director for the Oxford Centre of Religion and Culture, Liberation Theologian, author, Professor Extraordinarius in the Department of Philosophy, Practical and Systematic Theology at the University of South Africa, for which he is the first black man to receive an A rating. His understanding of both liberation and black theology is crucial to us being not only better humans, but better RE teachers. So I'm entirely honoured and grateful that he's agreed to be on the RE podcast. Welcome, Anthony.
Yes, hello. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, your list of accomplishments are quite vast, but of which one are you the most proud?
Oh, gosh. Really, it's corny, but I will probably say none of those things you've written down. It has been the son of Noel and Louisa Reddie.
Oh.
So those are my parents. That all the values and all the inspiration I've had to be who I am actually comes from them. So yeah, that's the most important.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer. And that also answers the question which I was going to ask, which is about what drives you. But actually, it's going to be their parenting of you, isn't it? And the values that they've instilled in you. I mentioned that you're a liberation theologian. Can you just explain to us what that is?
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, for me, I think important to say I'm actually a Black Liberation Theologian, but yes, I'm a Liberation Theologian. So for me, it's this fundamental belief that the God that is revealed, particularly within Jesus Christ and within the Scriptures, in terms of being a Christian, is a God that has always been committed to the liberation of particularly those people who are marginalised and oppressed. And so the God is not neutral. That when I was growing up in church, I remember a Sunday school teacher saying that God was a bit like an umpire in a cricket game. You know, like the kind of rules are established, and the umpire's job is to ensure fair play and that the game is played in an orderly fashion. The problem with that analogy is that it doesn't take account of the fact that what if you're playing a game where one side cheats and the rules are so biased that they ensure that that particular team wins the game every single time. Therefore, having an umpire that is neutral and simply ensures that the rules have been, adhered by, doesn't help if the game itself is biased and skewed. So therefore, a God of liberation, for me, is a God that says that in the midst of injustice, that takes many forms across different historical epochs, that God is committed to being on the side of those who are marginalised and oppressed, people who are told that they don't matter. A God who, through the example of Jesus, inspires us to challenge injustice, to question the status quo, and to seek to bring about change inspired by that same God.
And I guess the question we need to ask then is, why do we need it? You know, what's happened within Christianity where we have this sort of white elitism that we need Black liberation theology?
Yeah.
What's happened?
Yeah, okay. Well, I think one of the biggest problems we have is that Christianity made a deal with empire a long time ago. So I used to remember the exact dates when Constantine becomes emperor of the Roman Empire. And he converts. And when he converts, Christianity then becomes the religion of the empire. Prior to that, it was this dissident underground cult, so to speak, that was hiding in the shadows, people literally living in caves and fearing for their lives. They were seen as being opponents of empire, that actually in the language that we say now, in particularly in evangelical circles, that Jesus is Lord, was once a deeply subversive and a political statement, that if you're in the midst of empire and Caesar's a god and all power lies with Caesar, then to say Jesus Christ is Lord is actually to make a revolutionary statement. Our problem is that that's a long time ago. It's over 1,500 years ago. Christianity then becomes part of empire. Once it becomes part of empire and it then becomes part of the status quo, then people who have money and influence are able to dominate it and influence it. So by the time you get to things like the slave trade, from our vantage point, it would seem obvious that holding other human beings as chattel and selling them for profit is clearly wrong. Except, of course, if the people doing it are then the same people who are giving shed loads of money to the church and in conversation with the power brokers of the church, then surprising enough, like the church instead of being that body that then says, actually, we are on the side of the marginalized, because that's who Jesus was. Jesus was a colonized Palestinian Jew in the midst of Roman Empire. We're a long way away from that now. And so what's happened is that Christianity has become the religion of empire, it's become the religion of colonialism, it's become the religion that has sanctified the status quo, the white status quo. And obviously, at various points, even indigenous native people who have been colonized have probably colluded with it in order to get ahead. So therefore, when James Cone develops the systematic academic version of Black theology, first with his first book, Black Theology and Black Power in 1969, and then A Black Theology of Liberation in 1970, what he gives rise to is this movement of academic scholars like myself, who are also activists, who are saying, essentially what we're trying to do is to bring Christianity back to its early days, reminders of the time when it wasn't part of empire, and when the whole point of Jesus and those early disciples is speaking truth to power and critiquing existing power structures and saying that by saying Jesus Christ is Lord and by following the example of the God who brings Jesus back to life to say that evil and oppressive power never has the last word, that the last word belongs to God, and it's a God of liberation and justice and joy and righteousness.
There's so much I want to bring out of that. First of all, you just mentioned James Cone. Could I just ask you about The Cross and the Lynching Tree?
Oh, I mean, astounding book. Astounding book. I mean, as we speak, I'm actually writing a book on James Cone at the moment for SCM, Press, an introduction to Cone. And one of the later chapters will look specifically at The Cross and the Lynching Tree. Cone's genius is, I guess like all geniuses, is to take what we think is common and everyday, hidden in plain sight, and say, but actually, like, you haven't seen this properly. Actually, what you should be looking at and seeing is this. And it's like, oh, wow, so how do we not see that? So what Cone does in The Cross of the Lynching Tree is to go back and to say, well, let's look at the historical development of the cross and how we've seen the cross, how we've turned it into this very abstract, inoffensive ornament that many of us wear around our necks without any great thought, probably just as a piece of jewellery. Cone says, actually, if you understand the historical context of the cross, that is essentially it's an act of terrorism, state-sanctioned terrorism, that it's not actually about killing people. And I've said this in several places, that actually, then and now, if you want to kill people, human beings are very efficient at doing that. Quite frankly, take out a sword, a thrust to the chest, all over. So therefore, the cross was never about simply killing people. It was a way of the Roman Empire terrorizing people, particularly terrorizing a community of people whom they have conquered and whom they are subjugating to their empire. These are Jewish people in their own land. And saying, in case any of you get this crazy, nutty idea of trying to overthrow us, this is what happens to you. And anyone who knows the economics of the cross, know it takes you days to die. And actually, oftentimes, what probably killed people actually was probably suffocation, because in the end, your lungs just collapse in on yourself, and it's an agonizing way to die. That's the whole point. The whole point is that you are terrorizing people to show the cruel machinations of power. Cone says, well, actually, once you understand what the cross therefore means in its first century context under the guise of Roman Empire, then you see, well, hidden in plain sight in the American context is the parallel of lynching, because that had exactly the same purpose. That it's not simply about killing people, because again, in first century Judea, it's probably a spear or a sword. In the 18th and 19th century, a bullet to the brain would do it just as well. If it's about killing people, we can do that very easily. But if it's about torturing people, and Colden goes into great detail to show the vicious pleasure that many white people got from lynching. So there's a particular one, I think, right at the heart of the book where he talks about this pregnant woman who was strung up, and they slice open her stomach and pull out the fetus and then stomp it to death. And then there's this other occasion where this guy takes several hours to die. And whilst they are dragging through the street, bits of his body fall off, and people grab it as souvenirs. And there were huge crowds that would come to lynchings because it was a popular sport amongst polite white people who were overseeing a form of white-sponsored state terrorism to keep African Americans in their place and subjugated. So Cone says, so once you understand the parallels, then you see actually what Jesus' resurrection then means, in terms of that, is a subversion of all that form of hubristic white forms of hegemony that basically a colonized person of colour, who Jesus was historically, that when God therefore brings them back to life, it is God thumbing his or her finger up at the face of white supremacy and saying, you will not have the last word. And therefore it becomes a sign of redemptive suffering and hope for an oppressed group of people whose deaths are analogous to crucifixion. Normal white, particularly middle-class people, don't die that kind of death. Only subversive people who are seen as less than, as marginal figures, as people of no significance, they're the only ones who suffer that type of death. And therefore Cohn makes his critical relationship between the cross in the 1st century and the Lynching Tree in the 19th and the early part of the 20th century, and to say this is a sign of God's radical solidarity with all those who are oppressed and marginalised, and it's a sign of God's sovereignty and power to ultimately overthrow injustice and evil.
So in some ways, the resurrection is the greatest symbol of decolonisation, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's the overcoming of the oppressor.
It is, but of course what Christianity has done, and this and in many other ways, is to spiritualise it and to take it out of its political context. So now, what resurrection means is, it means that all of us can go to heaven if you believe the right things. If you are a good Christian who signs up to these particular doctrines and you say Jesus died for your sins. It's very interesting that according to many of our churches, in terms of the rubric that is written down in terms of our official teaching, in terms of the doctrines of the church, if you don't believe in Jesus, you'll go to hell. If you believe in Jesus and can talk to as many people as you like, so long as you believe the right thing, then you're going to go to heaven.
Yeah.
So what Cohn says, Cohn's politicization of this, well, I say politicization, no, it's not politicization. It is a restatement of its original understanding, is to say, actually, people who are going to be saved are those people who are in solidarity with all those who are being crucified.
So it's the Sermon on the Mount, isn't it? It's actually blessed are those.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So what does decolonisation of Christianity look like, and what steps do we need to take to make that happen?
Basically, I think it's 2 steps. First step is to recognise that it is colonised in the first place.
Yeah.
It is to recognise that what we often practice has very little, if any, relationship to the faith that emerges from a itinerant Galilean Jew. So one of the examples I often give, which I feature in the book I'm writing on Cohn, I mean, not to advertise the book because it's not finished yet, it's not out yet, so, But just to say that there's a whole section in the book where I talk about it's the encounter between Jesus and Pontius Pilate. Obviously, it's recorded in the various Gospels, but I tend to use John's version only because it just happens to be John's version. But, but like there are other versions. So Jesus and Pontius Pilate is there. Jesus is brought out before him. And the key thing I say in this particular bit, and I often use it in classrooms when I'm teaching, is that in some respects, Pontius Pilate is the first white man in the Bible. Probably not literally white, but here's the thing. He is a Roman governor. He is the representative of empire in a colonized state. Jesus brought to him as a subject of empire, but he is a native of this particular land. And Jesus is brought out before Pilate because the Jewish people themselves cannot kill Jesus because they have no right to put anyone to death in their own country because only Rome has that power. And Jesus and Pilate have this conversation. And eventually Pilate gives into the mob and hands Jesus over even though he knows he's innocent. So why is that significant? Because when our churches congregate around Easter, we read this text, and as a Christian, I've sat and read it many times, I've preached on it many times in our services. I've yet to even one occasion see any preacher of any denomination to say, but if we're being honest, when we read this text, given where we are and our history of Britain, we are not Jesus, we're Pontius Pilate. We represent empire. We had people like Pontius Pilate in various parts of the world undertaking Britain's, interests in other people's countries, defining the laws for them so that they themselves have no agency in their own country. That's what Pontius Pilate does. But of course, because Christianity has been so colonized, we see and we think ourselves like to be analogous to Jesus. So we think, oh, because Jesus is the founder of the church and we are church, and basically he is our antecedent. No, he's not our antecedent. Our antecedent is Pontius Pilate. So the first thing we've got to do, before we can even decolonize, is to acknowledge that it's been colonized in the first place.
Yeah.
That essentially this faith has been so shrouded in white privilege for centuries that we've even lost even the reality of what this faith has been made to do. So I think it's in 1872, I'm not quite sure of the date, but so David Livingstone, famed explorer in Southern Africa, says that the base of the British Empire is commerce, civilization, and Christianity. Christianity is in bed with empire and becomes the theological justification for commerce. It's always about taking resources and stealing other people's land and resources. Civilization, well, okay, so the trade-off for doing that is that we are going to enlighten you, like the white man's bird, and we're going to make you civilized and more like us. And Christianity becomes the justification for the first two. So first things first is to decolonize it. Then secondly, it's what kind of hermeneutical lenses then do we bring to the scriptures and to our reinterpretation of doctrines to see the ways in which those things have been skewed by empire to almost miss the essential point. Just give one example of that. But although I would describe myself as a liberation theologian, a black liberation theologian, I would also say I'm also a post-colonial scholar. And so therefore using the lens of colonialism and decolonialism or decolonizing texts and theology is then to rethink the way in which even accepted ways of thinking about the faith have often been skewed by the power of empire. So the classic example I often give, although there are many examples one can give, is the parable of the talents. Our traditional view says, well, of course, the villain's the third one because he's the one who takes what his master gave him, dug it in a hole, gave it back, doesn't work hard. That works if you assume that what we're really talking about, talents, is really about our gifts and graces and giving everything to God. Nonsense. It's not about that at all. No one would have understood that in first century Judea. Actually, talents, and sometimes some of the better concordances show you this, is actually a unit of money. So therefore, what you've got is three people. The first two collude with the master, who himself admits that he's cruel and hard. So when the third person calls him out and says, actually, like you're a hard man who reaps what he doesn't sow and takes and exploits people, I was scared, so I dug it in a hole. Interesting enough, like the master never disagrees with him and says, well, how dare you impugn my reputation? He says, actually, you're right. If you knew I was like that, then the very least you should have done is put it in the bank. So therefore, his only crime is not to make profit for a cruel master who admits that he's a cruel master. And yet, when we read that text, what we're meant to believe is that master's God. So what kind of God, then, is A, cruel, B, disproportionate, because he gives people different levels of resources to work with, and then third, shows no forgiveness whatsoever for someone who is scared of him and simply gives him back what he gave him in the first place. He didn't rob him. He didn't steal anything. He says, well, actually, for argument's sake, if you gave me £10, here's your tenner back again. So his only crime is not to make profit. And at the end of it, and this is the killer, which even when I was a kid, I knew nothing about any of post-colonial stuff. It never made sense. And it says, to those that have, more will be given. And to those that have little, even the little that they have will be taken from them and given away to others, and they'll be thrown into everlasting darkness with gnashing of teeth. How the hell is that supposed to be a God of love that we're supposed to follow? Yet because our texts have been shrouded in colonialism for so long, that what we end up doing is spiritualizing them to such an extent that what they do is to reinforce our existing values around capitalism. So essentially, how often has that text been used to reinforce hard work? Oh, it's really important that we all work hard and play our part.
Yeah.
Actually, all the third person does is just be honest enough to call out an exploitative boss when he sees one.
Yeah.
And says, actually, here it is, here's your stuff back, I'm not playing it again. Yet he gets punished, and we reinforce that in much of our preaching and much of our interpretation of that text. So basically what we need to do is to look at texts and doctrines through a post-colonial eye and to ask the question, who's been exploited and whose interests have been served by much of our traditional interpretation?
So what I'm understanding is that there's a sense of cowardice, as there was with Pontius Pilate. He didn't see justice happen because he was scared of the mob. And I think that actually there's a lot of people that are probably cowards within the church that aren't willing to be brave and to make the change that needs to happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a sense of capitalism, of greed, that's hidden behind this belief in meritocracy, that actually if you work hard, you're going to be okay and you're going to be rewarded, and that's biblical.
Yeah.
When actually that story, looking through it from a black theologian sort of lens, is actually about injustice. And that's a human leader. That's not God. It's almost a prediction of what's going to happen, about injustice that's going to happen.
Yeah, yeah.
If Jesus was living on earth today, what do you think he would say in terms of racism?
I have no doubt that he would call it out. I have no doubt that he would remind us that actually we have to face the truth, and face the truth about ourselves. That all the teaching is very clear about loving our neighbour, irrespective of who the neighbour is, and especially if we take the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's especially about crossing borders and boundaries and embracing those who are not like us and those who are who we've been told to see as being enemies and being foreigners or being different. I think his teaching would be very, very clear on that. Again, it's the way in which we've often spiritualised that in order to find a common sense way of justifying forms of parochialism, nativism, xenophobia, nationalism. These are all different terms for essentially where a group wants to bolster its identity by supporting people who look like them and they believe are part of them and demonising the other. Someone who's a different language, different culture, different skin colour, etc., etc. I believe fervently with every heart of my being. If this wasn't the case, then we would not be here having this conversation, So for me, Jesus would be calling that out, and actually probably would remind us that he was a person of colour himself.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk to you because actually something that's going on as we record this is the COP26 Climate Summit, which I know seems like a slight detour from what we're saying, but actually I don't know if it is. What are the links between climate change and liberation theology?
Oh, huge, and particularly Black Liberation Theology. So in 1944, again, a brilliant book was written by a guy called Eric Williams, and the book is called Capitalism and Slavery. As I said, first published in 1944, Andre Deutsch, been in print ever since. And Williams was a historian. He was a Caribbean historian, originally from the island of Trinidad and Tobago. And what he does is he does his forensic analysis of slavery, epoch of slavery, and says, actually, one of the things we miss is because obviously we think of it in terms of racial terror, in terms of white people capturing people of African descent and enslaving them. And that's all true. But what we miss is the economic underpinning of it. That basically, if you don't have the profit from slavery, then you don't have the capital that then helps to create the Industrial Revolution. And every major institution in Britain that is over, let's say, 200 years old in terms of banks and various other institutions, their initial capital growth came out of slavery. So, for example, Lloyd's of London makes a mint on insuring slave ships that are travelling across the world. All that to say that long before we began to exploit the earth and its resources, we were already exploiting people. We were already taking people as profit and using them in a disposable fashion in order to make stupendous money. So essentially, one of the interesting links is that when we think about who will be at COP26 and who will be the leading players there, they're often not people from the global majority. They're not people from the global south, even though they're the ones who are suffering at the sharp end in terms of the impact of climate change as we speak. So, for example, I wonder how many people from the Pacific Islands will be up front and centre talking about the fact that as we speak, their islands are disappearing under the waves because they're low-lying places. But yet, most of the conversation will be about white, rich leaders taking conversations about climate change. It's not that it doesn't impact upon us, but actually, the truth is, we've got the economics to at least keep it at bay for quite a while. So the people who are at the forefront of it in terms of their exploitation are people from the global south who have a long history of being exploited. First, in terms of people, as I said, in terms of slavery, in terms of colonialism, in terms of their resources being used for the benefit of others and not for themselves. And now we have the modern version of it in terms of capitalism, which is like the exploitation of their resources in terms of land and the natural resources that we have used with impunity, actually at the clear disadvantage of our world and of the creation that God has brought into being. So, yeah, so I think there's a very, very clear relationship. And no disrespect to Greta Thunberg. I'm a fan. I think she's brilliant. But it is interesting that it's a white Northern European young girl who becomes the face of activism, not a black and brown child, for example, from the global majority from the global south.
And so actually what we're saying is that climate change is going to impact the poor.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they're not actually being listened to. They're not giving the voices when it comes to exacting change. Yeah. And so actually what it's going to do is it's going to divide the gap between rich and poor even further. Yeah. Can I also ask, you mentioned that you're writing a book on James Cone, but you've actually written a book on Brexit. What conclusions have you come to? Okay, well, basically what I was trying to do on the book on Brexit was not so much to get into the argument about the pros or cons of being in the EU. I know that's the point. Obviously that was the point of the referendum. But actually, I think that was a misnomer. That actually, if you ask most people on either side of the debate what we actually know about the EU and how it really works, we don't really know much about it, the truth be told. I see it as a symbol of a much deeper question around what it means to be British. Yeah. And how do we understand Britishness? Is it in a modern plural sense that is indicative of migration flows, people come from different parts of the world, particularly people coming from the old empire? So, so the reason why I said that my most great accomplishment is to be the child of my parents is because they were part of the windrush generation. They came from Jamaica in the 1950s at the invitation of the British state to come and do jobs, to put it bluntly, that white people did not want to do. So actually, a way of summing up the book is probably my most popular tweet, which goes, so Brexit is the shingles to the chickenpox of empire. Okay, yeah. So essentially, what underpins Brexit, particularly for those people who were desperate to leave the EU, is what Paul Gilroy calls post-imperial melancholy. Yeah. So essentially, empire goes, we lose our sense of being special, of being exceptional. That's intrinsic to understand what it's to be British, is to believe yourself to be different from and better than. So we're not like those Europeans, we plucky Brits fought World War II, we beat Hitler, we are a great people. We should not be stuck within a broader construct that is really run by France and Germany. So we want to be untethered from them in order to reclaim our great, illustrious past as a great nation that is defined by empire. Empire went away in the same way that if you have chickenpox as a kid, it goes away. But it doesn't go away. It just gets incubated in your body. And then at a later point comes back, but comes back in a very vociferous way. So hence the tweet, as I said, Brexit is the shingles to the chickenpox of empire. So this is just something that's been festering for a long, long time. We still haven't dealt with it. It's been going for a long time. Yeah. It's been going for a long time. It was simply waiting for something to enact it, for it to rise up. Yeah. And I think the EU then becomes symbolic, as I said, for those deeper issues that we've always been wrestling with as a nation. So, for example, I think in 1955, so this is only 7 years after the windrush. So the first Caribbean migrants come on the 22nd of June 1948 on the ship SS Empire Windrush. In 1955, the last election that Churchill fights as Prime Minister before he's then forced to retire, he wants to run on a platform of Make Britain White Again. Gosh. 1955. Oh my gosh. And basically, it's only Sir Anthony Eden, his deputy Prime Minister, who's a more liberal Tory, who says to Churchill, no, you cannot do this. If you do this, you will open a Pandora's box and we will never get all that bile back in again. So even Anthony Eden says, but something like there's a line that we can't go beyond. Okay, we know British people are very concerned about all these immigrants coming to the country, but of course, and here's the irony I talk about in the book, British people are so concerned about people coming into the country, yet part of the empire that they want to reclaim, this sense of exceptionalism,
is built upon them doing exactly to many other countries that they take exception to what's happening to them. So, of course, you don't build an empire on consent. You build it on conquest and imposition. Yeah. So people travel all over the world and help themselves to other people's countries as the masters. Yet people who come into Britain in order to do the jobs that no one else wants to do are utterly resented, to the point whereby 70 years after that happened, we still end up with 3 black footballers representing their country, all born in this country as well, being subject to vicious racism because intrinsically for many, they're not really British.
Yeah. That hypocrisy, it extends everywhere, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're allowed to do this. You're allowed to miss. You're allowed to make mistakes. You are not.
Yeah.
And it's very subtle racism, but it is racism. What can we do then as teachers, as educators, as RE teachers? Who can we talk about? Are there black theologians that we could study? Is it good to think about historical figures? You know, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X.
Yeah.
Or actually, should we be thinking about sort of like modern day heroes? You know, I'm thinking Stormzy or King Jr. or someone like that.
Yeah.
What do we do in classrooms?
I would say both. I would say both. I mean, there's a place for looking at historic figures, to look at the people who made great actions in the past, made great contributions. But at the same time, I think you're right. You know, I mean, actually, when I think about my 19-year-old nephew, you know, I mean, Stormzy is one of his heroes, and Stormzy probably means more to him than Martin Luther King. Pointless to get to an argument as to which one's more important. It's about who they speak to now and how do we learn from their example. So Stormzy's work, for example, in creating all these opportunities for people to go to Cambridge and using his own money and using his own clout to do that is brilliant. And as someone of a certain age, I mean, I'm 57, I admire Stormzy, but he's not speaking to my generation, you know. I mean, he's speaking to my nephew who's 18 and 19 years old. Me, I grew up admiring Martin Luther King. It's a mistake to pit them against each other. They're both doing different things in their particular age. And therefore what we need to do is to show certainly the black contribution throughout all the ages. So we can go back to Mary Seacole. We can then talk about black soldiers who fought in World War I and World War II, particularly those people who volunteered, who were never conscripted, people who were part of the empire. For all my critique of empire, I also acknowledge that many black people have fought for empire because they felt it was part of their mother country and they had a sense of identification with it. So I want to celebrate that. So I think what RE teachers can do is to show the ways in which people who have been inspired by religious faith have made a difference, a positive difference to how we live with each other. And their values have inspired them to fight for humanitarian causes. And actually, one of the things that really annoyed me about the whole debate around Brexit, particularly the silence of many church leaders, is, of course, think of how many of our Christian denominations have been enriched by migration in the first place. That the Church of England would be nowhere, and my own Methodist church would be nowhere, if there were not migrants who would come into the country as faithful believers who have now propping up predominantly inner city churches. So one of the really important books, and I think contemporary black theologians to read, I mean, I would cite 2. I would not name myself, because as you said, I've written quite a few books, and I think, you know, I mean, they can look after themselves. So I would say Azariah Franz Williams' book called Ghost Ship. Fantastic book in terms of talking about the Church of England.
I interviewed him last week, so that was last week's episode. He came out the week before you, so amazing guy, Yeah,
and then another one, which I think is just as important but in a different way, is Darrell Robinson Brown, Black, British and Gay. Or is it Black, Gay and British? I should know better because, I mean, I endorsed it. And again, he's Black and British born, but talks about how the church has had, again, this contradictory attitude around grace on the one hand, that says that God's generosity, that we don't deserve it, but God is gracious because that's God's nature. Yet on the other hand, we have this contradictory thing that then says, but although we believe that, we're still going to punish some people because we don't like their sexual lifestyle. And it's like, yeah, but grace that's conditional is not grace.
Yeah.
That's just a basic oxymoron, you know. I mean, either it's grace, in which case it's generous and it's unbounded, and it's not conditional,
Yeah.
or if it's any of those things, then by definition it's not grace.
Yeah.
So his book is important because what it also critiques, and this is why I'm a Black Liberation theologian, is all forms of oppression. So, for example, many black Christians will be anti-racist, and quite rightly so, but will also be homophobic. So now you'll be like, the Bible says. Well, the Bible says lots of things. The Bible says that slaves should obey their masters, but I've never seen anyone who has come from an enslaved background who believes that we should take Paul literally seriously when he says that. But somehow when we then read other texts that are condemning sexual minorities, suddenly, oh yeah, but that's what the text says. Well, make up your mind if it says something and we take it literally, or we say, well, actually, we take it in context and we critique it, particularly if its impact is to oppress and marginalise people. So I think that's a very important book.
Yeah. And so would you make then a comparison between the homophobia that currently exists in the church and
absolutely.
Historic racism?
Yeah.
Where the Bible is being used to oppress people rather than people really understanding what the Bible is trying to say about love and grace and forgiveness.
Yeah.
Do you feel that there is a need to re-establish sort of black history from before the slave trade? Do you think we sort of start black history with the slave trade and we forget the bits before?
Yeah.
When there were kings and rulers and warriors and powerful people?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think one of the mistakes, I mean, although I understand how colossal the slave trade is, I understand what a form of existential terror is. I get all that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. We need to go back before that and to look at the fact that there were different communities, there were a variety of worldviews. They weren't perfect. Pre-slavery Africa wasn't a perfect place any more than Europe or any other place was. It didn't need to be perfect. It was just as it was. So it was disrupted.
Yeah.
Certainly theologically, an important part I've often tried to do in my own work is to get people to go back and to look at the early creation of Christianity and say, well, actually, people like St. Augustine and the other church fathers were often people of colour, often people from North Africa. Augustine was from what would be modern-day Algeria.
Yeah.
So why have these people been whitewashed out? You know, I mean, I did a whole term looking at St. Augustine in my university course at Birmingham as an undergraduate in the 80s.
Yeah.
And at no point did anyone say that this was a black man. Not once, never came up. Years later, I learned that. So why is it then that we can't even acknowledge that the Christian faith has never been a white religion? Its earliest roots are in North Africa and in the Mediterranean.
Yeah. If you could wake up tomorrow and one thing was different, what would you want that one thing to be?
For me, that would be the affirmation of blackness. That would be, I mean, I nearly said that the absence of white supremacy, but that I think still kind of centers whiteness. So let me go with the other one to say it would be the affirmation of what it is to be black. Yeah. And all the synonyms and all the symbolisms of that would not start from a negative portrayal, but actually would start from an affirmative and a positive one. Because I think that is what is still often internalized, both within black communities themselves, but also in terms of the media depiction of black people. So really that's the thing I would want to see. I want to be able to walk in my skin and for there to be no consequences in terms of how people see me and how they perceive me. Because that is still the reality, you know. I mean, so I work in Oxford. I love it. It's a great place to be. But it's interesting how when I work with white colleagues, they can walk into some of the buildings with impunity. I work there. Oftentimes, unless I show my ID card, they do not see me and think, well, there goes an Oxford academic who's just walking into his place of work. So to be able just to be me without there being some political issue about how my body's perceived, because we have be able to embrace all the positivity that goes with blackness.
Yeah, wonderful. And what would you like our final thought to be as we end?
I think I'll give the final word to James Baldwin only because he's such a big person for James Cone in Cone's own writings. And so Baldwin says this, he says that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced.
Can you just say that one more time?
Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Anthony G Reddie, what a delightful man you are. Thank you so much for this conversation. People are going to love this, I know they are. So thank you so much for giving up your time.
It's been an absolute pleasure. It really has. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. My name is Louisa Jane Smith, and this has been the RE Podcast, the podcast for those of you who think RE is boring, which it is. We just proved it to you. But thank you so much for listening to us bore the life out of you.